Hey there, today I am making mini Coptic stitch notebooks just in time for Christmas. These mini notebooks would make an excellent addition to your special someone's stocking this year. These notebooks are 5.5 inches tall by 4.25 inches wide. I began by cutting 8.5 by 11 inch paper in half to make 8.5 by 5.5 inch sheets of paper. I am using a heavier weight of copy paper for these DIY notebooks. Next, take these sheets and fold them in half. Then rinse and repeat until you have a stack of folded sheets. If you're looking for a great meditative stress reliever, this could be it. We are going to use these sheets to make signatures, which are groups of folded sheets of paper. When the signatures are sewn together, they form a text block, the pages of a book. I took 5 sheets of folded paper and stacked them together to make one signature, and then press down the edges with a bone folder. Repeat this step until you have as many signatures as you'd like for your notebook. For the 2 notebooks I'm making, I had around 6 to 8 signatures in each one. For Coptic stitch notebooks like we are making today, you will need to make the covers before sewing the text block together. This is because the text block is sewn directly to the covers. To make the covers, I took some 8.5 by 11 inch chipboard and cut that down to 2 5.5 by 4.25 inch sides. A little while ago, I purchased this beautiful cork fabric from Lens Mills and knew I wanted to use it for a bookbinding project. The only issue is it's not a thick bookbinding fabric, and when I did a test sheet to see how it would hold up with glue, I noticed some of the glue seep through the fabric. So I decided to use an iron-on adhesive for this project. I cut the fabric down to around 3/4 inches larger than my chipboard on each side. So each piece of the fabric measured around 7 by 5.75 inches. Then I cut the heat and bond to the size of the chipboard. I pressed the heat and bond to the back side of the fabric with the paper side facing up. While I followed the instructions on the packaging, I found I had to iron the sheets a bit longer to get them to adhere to the fabric. I'm unsure why, but user error has yet to be ruled out. I waited for the pieces to cool, then removed the paper and pressed the fabric with adhesive onto the chipboard. I used some parchment type paper over the fabric so I didn't burn the fabric. Once cooled, I trimmed the edges of the fabric to even out the sides. For one of the books, I attempted a library fold on the corners, so I tried to round the corners of the boards after they were adhered to the fabric. Don't do this. I was experimenting and this caused me a huge headache of rounding all of the corners of my signatures. If you would like to round the corners like this, I would make the covers a bit bigger than the signatures and slightly round them ahead of time. I'm still very new to bookbinding, so I'm learning from my mistakes as I go, which I hope will be actually beneficial for you, because you get to learn from my mistakes too. Perhaps I'll change my name to the What Not to Do craft channel. For the library corners, which are thicker and sturdier, glue and fold all 4 corners in. Next, glue and fold in the head and tail of the cover. Use a bone folder to help press down the fabric along the edge and onto the board. Then repeat with the sides. I placed wax paper over the boards and put them in my press to dry for a couple hours after this step. To be honest, I preferred the method I used for the gold book to glue down the edges. Trim the corners a few millimeters away from the corners, about the thickness of the chipboard times 1.5. Glue and fold down the head and tails of the cover first, pressing the fabric down at the edges. Then repeat with the sides of the cover. Holy smokes, that was easier. I only say that because I didn't have to round the edges of the signatures for this one, a task I hope to never have to repeat, at least not before buying a better edge punch. I then tossed these covers in the press to dry them as well. Ooh, shiny. This Nitro break was brought to you by Nitro. For the inside of the covers, I measured and cut black and gray cardstock down to 5 by 3.75 inches, leaving 1/4 inch around the inside of the cover for the fabric to show. I glued on the inside cover sheets smooth them with the bone folder, and press these in my book press until they dried as well. Ideally, after this step, you'll want to leave them for a few hours to overnight until they dry completely. Okie dokie, before we stitch these bad boys together, we need to punch holes into the signatures and the covers. I made myself a little template so I knew where to make the holes. On a separate piece of paper, I measured 1 inch from either end and made a mark, and then made a third mark in the center. I used this template to mark the edges of my signatures. Then, using an awl with a piece of foam underneath, I punched a hole at each of these marks on the signatures. Then I clamped the covers together and used the template to punch holes no more than 1/4 inch away from the edge of the boards. I punched these holes through both signatures at the same time so the holes would line up for stitching. Now we can finally stitch our books together. For simplicity, I'll demonstrate the stitching on only one of these notebooks since they are identical. Grab some wax thread and a curved needle. Cut a piece of wax thread the length of your notebook times as many signatures as you have, and thread your needle. Stack your signatures inside the covers. Pick up the cover and the first signature. On the signature, we are going to label the holes from left to right, 1, 2, and 3, or first, second, and third. Open the signature and sew through the first hole, leaving about a 3-inch tail. Pick up the cover and sew from the inside to the outside of the first hole. Then sew back into the first hole of the first signature. From the inside of the signature, sew out the second hole. Then sew from the inside to the outside of the second hole in the cover. Sew back into the second hole of the signature. Tighten the thread if needed, but don't pull too hard or you'll rip the paper. Sew out the third hole of the signature from the inside. Then through the third hole in the cover. And then sew back into the third hole of the first signature. Sew under the thread and tie a knot on the inside. Then sew back out the third hole. Sew around the threads between the cover and the first signature. Pick up the second signature and sew into the third hole of the second signature. So we're starting from the other end. From the inside of the second signature, sew out the second hole of the signature. Sewing in the same direction, in this case right to left, sew under the threads between the first signature and the cover. Then sew back into the second hole of the second signature. Sew out of the first hole of the second signature. And once again, sew behind the threads between the cover and the first signature. Pick up the third signature and sew into the first hole. Sew out of the second hole of the third signature. Then sewing in the same direction, in this case left to right, sew under the threads between the first and second signatures. Then sew back into the second hole of the third signature. Sew out of the third hole of the third signature. Then sew under the threads between the first and second signature. Picking up the fourth signature, sew into the third hole of that signature. Sew out of the second hole of the fourth signature. Sewing from right to left, sew under the threads between the second and third signatures. Then sew back into the second hole of the fourth signature. Sew out of the first hole of the fourth signature, then sewing from right to left, sew under the threads between the second and third signatures. Pick up the fifth signature and continue these steps until all signatures are sewn together. When you're finished sewing on the last signature, pick up the back cover and sew from the inside to the outside of the first hole of the cover. Sew into the first hole of the last signature. Then sew out of the second hole of this signature. Sew through the cover from the inside to the outside. Sew under the threads between the last two signatures, and then sew back into the second hole of the last signature. Sew out of the third hole of the last signature, then through the cover from the inside to the outside. Sew under the threads between the last two signatures. Then sew back into the third hole of the final signature. Tighten the stitching if needed. Tie a knot on the inside around the inside stitching and cut the thread. Flip the book to the inside of the first signature, tie a knot with the remaining tail that we left, and cut the thread. And we're done! Yay! Now go out and make a few of these babies for your friends, family, neighbors, or heaven forbid, you actually make something for yourself. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this Coptic Stitch mini notebook tutorial beneficial. Drop me a like if you did and subscribe for more Total Pamarchy, the craft channel with a little anarchy. Until next time, are you ready for Christmas? 'Cause I'm not.